TNT. Welcome to Brian Lehrer Live. We're here live Wednesday nights at 7:30. Tonight, what the election results mean to our lives and the implications of being black and passing for white.
What box do you now check on the form?
Well, I check other.
But we begin with the dramatic election results in New York and nationwide, which we are still digesting. And if you haven't heard yet, the change in Congress has already led to a change in the cabinet.
Now, after a series of thoughtful conversations, Secretary Rumsfeld and I agreed that the timing is right for new leadership at the Pentagon. Our military has experienced an enormous amount of change and reform during the last 5 years while fighting the war on terror, one of the most consequential wars in our nation's history. Don Rumsfeld has been a superb leader during a time of change. Yet he also appreciates the value of bringing in a fresh perspective during a critical period in this war. Don Rumsfeld is a patriot who served our country with honor and distinction. He is a trusted advisor and a friend, and I'm deeply grateful to his service to our country. I've asked Bob Gates to serve as the Secretary of Defense.
With me now to help understand what really happened and what it really might mean to our lives is Joyce Purnick, political writer for the New York Times. Hi, Joyce. Welcome to the program. Good to see you.
What a 2 days, huh?
It is some 2 days, a roller coaster of change that I guess is still cascading.
Indeed.
Any guess as to what the appointment of Robert Gates as Defense Secretary will mean to actual policy on the Iraq War?
Not immediately. I mean, I've listened to all of the pundits all day long. As you know, I don't cover defense policy. And they were saying that this is the end of the neocons and it's back to the cons, which means more isolationism and less going out on the edge. But what that actually will mean, I suspect what that has to mean is ultimately some kind of timetable that they won't call a timetable, right?
Right.
To disengage from Iraq. That's what the Democrats have been calling for. That's what got a lot of Democrats elected and got a lot of Republicans kicked out of both the House and the Senate, and in some cases even governor's seats. So I suspect that's what's going to happen.
And I think I've already heard the seeds of starting to blame the Iraqis for any failures in the war. They're not stepping up. They're not taking charge. Yes. They're not cracking down on the militias. That kind of thing. That started
at least 10 days ago, as I remember.
Yes. In his news conference today, the president kept talking about, of all things, bipartisanship. And after an entire campaign of trying to equate Democrats with cut-and-run defeatism, he said, quote, "Their spirit is such that they want to protect America, and Democrats are going to support our troops just like Republicans." That's a little different than a few days ago.
Don't you love politics? I mean, you have to love it, right? It's like there is no entertainment like politics. Look, if he's not a realist, because a lot of people have said, and they say over and over again, that he's very stubborn. Some of the people around him are realists.
The president.
The president. The House is now going to be led by Democrats. It looks as though the Senate is going to be led by Democrats. If he's going to stand there and say, I'm not going to deal with these people, we'll have to invent a new word for gridlock. So he's going to have to get some of his initiatives through. Other than, if he doesn't, he's going to become a completely inept lame duck. His reputation and his legacy will be trashed. He's going to have to get along to some degree. So, of course, he had to strike that tone.
And this is just after a campaign where we saw things like pictures of Osama bin Laden and Kim Jong-il morphing into Democrats. And now he says Democrats are going to support our troops just like Republicans, and their spirit is such that they want to protect America. Reality
intrudes.
Intrudes.
Well, when I was out on the campaign trail, I mean, there were ads that Republicans or the Republican campaign congressional committee were running for Republicans, showing Democrats as puppets, turning Nancy Pelosi into some kind of a demonizing wrangle. I mean, and I'm, by the way, both sides did it. It's just, So that's what we're now dealing with. I mean, that's
right, because of who won and what the contradictory rhetoric was.
Everybody knows that this is what politics is, even though we take it so seriously when it's happening. Everybody knows that no one fully takes it seriously and no one fully means it.
Now, some pundits got this election right. Some got it wrong. One who got it right on this program a few weeks ago was the Democratic strategist, James Carville. Give me a number. How many seats are the Democrats going to pick up?
It will be less than 7 or more than 20.
Less than 7 or more than 20?
It'll break one way or the other. I mean, the conventional wisdom is that it's going to be somewhere between 14 and 20. And I think it's going to break one way or the other. My guess is it'll break in the Democrats' favor, but it could break again.
Got at least that much right.
It was pretty safe.
Well, you think it was pretty, but you know, a lot of the conventional wisdom, as he said, I think, was that the Democrats were going to hover right around that 15 House seats that they needed to take the majority. He says the national tide was going to turn either for the Democrats, as it did. They took about 33, I think.
Well, this was how long ago?
Oh,
this interview?
3-4 weeks.
Yeah, well, you know, it's just polls. That's all anybody is looking at. Nobody has a crystal ball and can intuit what's going to happen in all 50 states in every single district. So what he was doing was looking at the polls at the time, and I suspect. So I don't know.
Well, you wrote in the New York Times the other day that if the Democrats win, they will have turned conventional wisdom on its head in a number of ways. Did they?
They did. One had to do with gerrymandered districts and how it was going to be impossible. I mean, we were hearing this as recently as last spring, that it was going to be next to impossible. There's always a little out for the Democrats to win because both parties had gerrymandered districts, created safe seats. The Republicans were in control, so they had more safe seats. They were actually more clever at creating safe seats. The walls were so high protecting them that ultimately, no matter what happened, the Republicans would retain control. Well, we know that didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? You've heard the word, probably so much that I almost hate to say it, but people, all the analysts are now saying, well, there was a tsunami. And when there is this kind of a storm, and there were also parallels to Category 4 or Category 5 hurricane, and the levees were built to hold back a Category 1 or a Category 2.
And I've also heard Republicans who lost, like Mike DeWine today, use it as an excuse.
Yeah.
Why did you lose? Because there was a perfect storm.
It was a perfect
It's not
storm.
that I did anything wrong that turned off my constituents. There was this perfect storm of national factors and technical factors.
Well, in some cases, the nationalization of the campaign, as all the experts call it, is actually, it happened in '94 and it happened this time and it happened after Watergate in '74. It does happen. That's what happened in this case.
Right. But if you're part of that national bloc, in this case the Republican majority in the Senate or the House, and Tom Kean Sr. used it about the defeat of Tom Kean Jr., also the perfect storm. If you do it, if you're a part of it, then you have to suffer the consequences, and you can't blame other people.
That's right. Exactly right. And I think that the concept that could happen, the concept that Karl Rove could make a mistake, which I think and others think he did, which is what Karl Rove did was play the base. And what he said is, we're going to go to our voters and get them out. And he did not try, from what I understand, to convince the independents. Figure the independents will break half and half, whatever.
The conventional wisdom was, in part, that there's no such thing anymore in America as a swing voter. We're so polarized that you either get out the conservative base or you get out the liberal base, and whichever one is bigger in a given election year wins. This is the revenge of the swing voter.
Whoops, didn't happen. The other thing that didn't happen was all politics is local, that concept. It's mostly true, except as people I interviewed who used to, defend it all the time, say, well, it's true except when it isn't true.
Right.
And what happened was that one issue after another, which people cared about, local issues, suddenly weren't that important anymore. I was out, Brian, in Indiana for 4 days. I went to 3 congressional districts, all of which were held by Republicans, all of which have gone Democratic. Now, when I went out there, I had read all the stories I could find about Indiana. What did I know about Indiana? Not a lot. What do Indianans care about? What do the Hoosiers care about? They're furious about the fact that the governor of Indiana, who was a Republican, a factor, lease the toll road, the state's toll road, to an international conglomerate. Furious, and that's why they're going to vote Democratic. Why else are they going to vote Democratic? Well, there are parts of Indiana that are on Central Time and parts of Indiana that are on daylight savings time at different times of the year. So you have to wear 2 watches or whatever and calculate all the time. And that was also the governor's doing. So they're going to vote Democrat. Well, I spent 4 days out there. I went to a Friday night football game. I went to street fairs and festivals and apple dunkings and all. I went to Walmarts. 2 people mentioned those issues. I went to an automobile plant. Nobody mentioned those local issues.
So they talked about the war.
Person after person after person. And this is before the polls came out that showed that. They talked about Iraq, number 1. Illegal immigration.
Yes.
Which, I mean, Indiana does not have a huge number of illegal immigrants, but Indiana does have concentrations of illegal immigrants who were taking plant jobs in non-unionized shops.
But that was supposed to work to the Republicans' advantage. That was supposed to be, as some people put it, the gay marriage of 2006, to turn out an angry conservative base, and it didn't work.
Well, it didn't. The other issue, by the way, is health care, especially prescription drugs for the elderly. It didn't work, I think, for 2 reasons. Number 1, the Democrats did something this time that I haven't seen them do in my lifetime, or covering politics anyway, which is they deliberately put up very conservative, by Democratic standards, candidates. So on those issues, they were as conservative as on illegal immigration, as conservative as the Republican candidate.
Let me tell.
The other thing was that the president's policy, which they saw as allowing for amnesty, ticked them off. So it didn't work.
Well, which is kind of the paradox in the Rovian strategy of playing to your base this year, because in some ways, to be fair, President Bush did play to the very conservative base, and in some ways he didn't. The very fact of the Medicare prescription drug plan, the fact that it was big government, was playing to a different sensibility. The No Child Left Behind, whether you think it was well done or not, was playing to a big government. Government has a constructive role to play. Non-conservative sensibility, and the immigration reform. So maybe he failed to woo people in the middle sufficiently, but he also failed to cater the base enough sufficiently to keep them energized.
Yeah, well, I don't know the numbers on his voters.
Turnout,
I just don't know, and I don't know if we have that yet. It must be in some exit poll. I don't know.
Yeah. Hopefully we'll have it
But I
tomorrow.
think we will know, and my guess is that you're right. I think classic conservatives have not been happy. I don't think they voted for the other guy in most cases. I think they stayed. My guess is they stayed home.
We are going to take some of your phone calls in this segment, and here's the question. You can say anything you want, but here's a question. And the question is, if you're a Democrat, and we're in New York City, so let's face it, I know we've got about 80% Democrats out there. If you're a Democrat, what do you want the new Nancy Pelosi-led House to do first? What do you want the Democratic House to actually do when you stop partying that they won? So give us a call, 212-251-0801, 212-251-0801. What do you want the Democratic-controlled House to do first? Now, you talked about the Democrats putting up conservative candidates.
Not everywhere, but in many places.
Liberal blog, Daily Kos, says that's the new conventional wisdom myth. Headline on Coast today, these new Dems sure are conservative. One of the most moronic media lines last night and continuing through today is how conservative these new elected Democrats are, except they're not. In the Senate, Bernie Sanders, Vermont, so conservative that he's a socialist. Sherrod Brown, Ohio, New Jersey liberal rating, or NJ liberal rating is 84.2. Sheldon Whitehouse, Rhode Island, an unabashed liberal in every definition of the word. I mean, he defeated a liberal Republican. Back to Brown. For comparison's sake, Harold Ford, a real conservative Democrat, had a 58.3 rating as compared to 84 for Brown. Claire McCaskill, Missouri. She's a progressive on every major issue. In fact, it was one of the GOP's lines of attacks against her, as the conservative Real Clear Politics wrote in its race summary. So, fair point.
Of course, it's a fair point, but I could give you a list probably even longer, particularly in congressional races where the electorate is smaller than in governor's races or in Senate races, obviously, which are statewide and draw from a large demographic group. So if you want to run in a conservative district and defeat a conservative Republican, it's very hard if you are not in many of these places, a Democrat who's anti-abortion, who is in favor of putting up a wall at the border. I mean, you can go through the and the ones that I'm thinking
Casey,
of.
conservative on abortion,
Casey,
Pete Santorum in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and again, House. I'm thinking more of the House seats where you do have to appeal to a more discrete voting base, right? It's a smaller group of people than if you're voting for a Senate candidate or for a gubernatorial candidate. So I think, obviously, it's both out there.
So we will have a Nancy Pelosi-led House.
Yeah.
Have you followed her career? Is she the liberal San Franciscan caricature that the Republicans try to portray her as during the campaign?
She's not a conservative, and neither is Charlie Rangel. Charlie Rangel is
who was also used in those ads.
I'm not sure he was used in ads, but I know that
he was used in ads.
Okay, I know he was invoked in debates.
I've seen the ads and I've spoken to him about it, and he thought the fact that they put his picture up there on national ads, you know, that he was the archetypal New York Democrat.
Right.
He thought it was because he was black. They were able to use that as an extra scare tactic against people when they saw Charlie Rangel was going to be the head of the Ways and Means Committee if the Democrats take
I don't
control.
disagree with that. I think that that race card was played. I wasn't sure it was an ads. I know it was invoked in debates a lot by the Republican candidates, Pelosi and Rangel.
Right.
So I mean that should be quite fascinating.
So we've asked the listeners what they want the Pelosi-led House to do. What do you think it's going to do?
You know, I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. This idea of now you're asking me to develop a new conventional wisdom. I mean, give it a day or two. I'm really not sure what they're going to do. I know what I think they should do, which is they shouldn't do what Newt Gingrich did, which was basically declare war. I mean, I think he used that phrase.
Against the Democrats and the liberals.
Yeah. I mean, I think that if they turn the next 2 years, if they want to win in 2008 or have a chance of winning in 2008, and if they declare war and play to the partisanship of this country, we're going to be back. They're going to be back where they started.
Here is one document that indicates what they promised to do. You know, Nancy Pelosi came out with a first 100 hours, not first 100 days, first 100 hours agenda if the Democrats take control. And I've got it here. And so, for example, we will make our economy fairer, and we will begin by raising the minimum wage. We will make health care more affordable for all Americans, and we will begin by fixing the Medicare prescription drug program to put seniors first by negotiating lower drug prices. Medicare can't negotiate under Bush with the drug companies. We will also promote stem cell research. We will promote college opportunity and begin by cutting interest rates for student loans in half. And we will energize America by achieving energy independence, and we will begin by rolling back the multi-billion-dollar subsidies for big oil. That's actually some pretty specific stuff.
That is very specific. So you should be asking a different question. What's Bush going to do? If these bills get to his, right, I mean, assuming the Senate goes Democratic as well, which is still a little unclear. If these things actually happen.
Great question. He's never vetoed anything yet.
Right. What's Bush going to do?
Yeah. Or can she really get these things
Well, of course.
through?
I don't know if she can get them through. I thought you were asking me about tactics and how they were going to handle themselves. Now, I know about some of those specifics, but I don't know that she's going to be able to get some of them through, especially despite those comments that you read to me, who some of the members of the House are. Believe me, we're not talking about Pelosi-type liberals in many cases.
Right. So it's not all one block. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. Now, what's going to happen under a Democratic Congress? Well, on this program a few weeks ago, Democratic strategist Paul Begala made this dire prediction.
But here's what's going to happen. Democrats take the House, we'll have a constitutional crisis. Save this tape. Democrats will subpoena legitimately the oversight authority under the Constitution. The President of the United States will say no. It will be like segregation. It'll be massive resistance. He'll tell Nancy Pelosi, you send the Capitol Police, I'll send the 101st Airborne, we'll meet on the mall and see who wins.
On what grounds? Executive privilege?
He'll claim, look what they did with Dick Cheney and the Energy Task Force. And they won in the courts with their right-wing judges. They're gonna claim executive privilege, national security, the dog ate my homework, anything and everything. It will be massive resistance. And you know, God help the Republic. I'm not entirely sure. I have less faith in our federal courts since Bush v. Gore than ever in my life. And I'm educated as a lawyer. But I think it's going to be an enormous constitutional crisis.
I'm going to save this tape.
Thank you.
please.
And we did.
Oh, please. No.
Well, it's not just anybody. It's Paul McGollum.
I don't care who it is.
Investigate, resist.
I prefer the philosophy of Murray Heimbinder. Murray Heimbinder was my social studies teacher at Jamaica High School. He's now gone, I'm sorry to say. He was fabulous. And he taught us something that has actually held, because every time it hasn't held, it's been reversed, which is this is a centrist country. And every time, and that's why I say, if the Democrats do what Gingrich did, then something is going to pull them back to the center. And I find it hard to believe that you could make that kind of mistake the second time in 12 years.
They're going to investigate the president, though. They're going to investigate contracts to Halliburton and this whole list of things that you could predict right now. They are going to do it, right?
Well, they'll hold some hearings, but, you know, constitutional crisis and armies,
all right.
I doubt it.
Let's see. Line 1, 2, 3. Marilyn and Chelsea. Hi, what do you want the Democrats to do first?
I wanted to get rid of corporate influence. This may sound utopian, but so far as the special interests and how our Congress is bought by big corporations is really frightening. I'm also interested in universal health care for all.
Marilyn, thank you. Now, Joyce, you were nodding. Yes, it's utopian.
It is utopian.
But, you know, there are two schools. We had this debate on the radio show.
Not on the health care, on the other.
On the campaign finance.
Well, exactly. I mean, the same corporate sources support Democrats as support Republicans. And so the idea that Democrats would not be, to some degree, beholden to the money powers of people who have a lot of money.
And we certainly saw it in the last few months where a lot of this corporate money that was going almost only to Republicans in recent years, because Republicans had almost all the power.
Shifted, didn't it?
Started to shift closer to 50-50. So they've got their hooks in there. But this is, I think, an important debate within the Democratic Party, isn't it? There are the.
I hope so.
There are the. I think it's more of like the Netroots people who want the Democrats to go to the source of what they see as fundamental corruption, even if it's legal, in the government, which is that kind of thing. And then there are others who say, no, that's just going to turn people off. What we need to do is these piecemeal policies, more money for college education, more prescription drug benefits, things like that. And this is, I think, the source of get to the root or get to the branches kinds of government.
You asked me to predict one thing. I'll predict, and we're going to see a hell of a lot of debate. I mean, this is not going to be a well-organized front the way that the Gingrich folks were.
Marilyn in Manhattan, what should the Democrats do first?
Hello. I'd like to see the new government, the new Democratic-led government, reconnect America with the rest of the world, get back to treaty making instead of tearing up treaties, negotiate with people that we've refused to speak to, and repair our relations with so many countries in the rest of the world.
Thank you, Marilyn, which is another sticky wicket for the Democrats, I think, because at least with respect to the war, if not foreign policy in general, the executive branch holds most of the cards.
Exactly.
So what does a Congress do functionally to influence war policy and to influence treaty making and other kinds of foreign policy?
You know, this is always led by the White House. This is always led by the president in every single administration that I can remember, all of these issues. So you know, what can they do? They can yammer, I suppose. They can complain, but I'm not sure they can do as much as Marilyn thinks they might be able to do.
William in Forest Hills. Hi, you're on the air, William. What do you want the Democrats to do first?
How are you, Brian? I think one of the first thing they should do is to raise the minimum wage. That's number one. And I think the very second thing they should do is to devise the kind of legitimate infrastructure that's going to have to be installed to prevent this from happening again. The whole purpose of this wave is to reestablish civility in the government, the checks and balances that were supposed to be there to begin with, because everything else you do will not be effective without this structure set up.
Thank you very much. He used the word civility. Say, listen to Nancy Pelosi today, she wants a bipartisan, cooperative relationship with the Republicans. To listen to President Bush today in his news conference, he lowered his voice too.
Right.
He used the words common ground. I don't think I've heard that before.
Right.
Can they pull it off? Are they either of them sincere about pulling it off?
We're leaving out so far in this conversation one enormous factor, and that is the presidential race of 2008. And who the emerging candidates are, and how the two parties will position themselves in order to give themselves the advantage. I mean, whether it's Hillary Rodham Clinton or whoever on either side, whoever's going to emerge, they keep changing. You know, that's something we hadn't talked about, and that is going to be a huge factor in how each party conducts itself.
We have 5 minutes left, and I want to use it to talk about New York.
Ah, yes.
Eliot Spitzer.
Eliot Spitzer and Alan Hevesi. Yeah.
Right, and we'll get to Hevesi, but Spitzer and Governor Pataki already met today.
And shook hands. Right?
And established what?
That they like each other. No. Pataki said he's been a great attorney general. He's going to be a fine governor. Other than that,
you know, Spitzer got this almost Superman-like image over his time as a giant killer, as Attorney General, and then this can-do, unstoppable, inevitable candidate on the campaign trail. Is he going to be brought down to earth now by inevitable realities, or what's he going to confront?
You know, he's been around in Albany in a very powerful position for a long time, and one thing that he did is avoid Albany. I mean, to a very large degree. I mean, the 3 men in the room concept, the gridlock in Albany, the fact that so many things happen under the radar, and it's between the heads of the two houses of the legislature and the governor, and you know all of that, as I'm sure our viewers do. He's just stayed out of that, and now he's going to have to not only deal with it, he's going to have to decide whether he's going to become a part of it or going to try to smash it. And he said he's going to try to reform.
Smash it.
Reform is a big word now.
But it seems to me that the paradox is, or one paradox is, that, yes, he wants to break up the so-called 3 men in a room system, which means taking power away from the two legislative leaders and distributing it more among other legislators. That would make it more small d Democratic.
Or change the Democratic and somehow change the Democratic leader, which he might have the power to do, by putting up another candidate who would be more malleable than Shelley Silver.
But at the same time, he needs those leaders to work with him on all this other agenda that he has, health care, housing, Medicaid reform, property tax reductions. So can he fight them, try to take away their power, and have them help him at the same time?
I don't see how he can take away their power. Again, I think if he can change he can't change the Republican, but if he can somehow change the Democrat so that there's somebody who's beholden to him for his or her job as the head of the assembly, then I think you'll see more cooperation. I wouldn't be shocked if he has that, if he's thinking about it, but that's not on his mind. But whether he will be able to do that and how we would be able to move Shelley Silver out of the way, I don't know.
You said Alan Hevesi.
Yeah.
He got reelected.
That is so, yeah. Well, most people thought he would. And it's fascinating now, because what happens to all of the speculation about whether he should be removed, impeached, whether he should resign, whether he'll be indicted. Spitzer ran away from him, and now suddenly they're in the same government together. The editorial boards, screamed and yelled, get rid of him, get rid of him. Well, now the people have spoken. Polls show that 92% of the people knew what he'd done, and he nonetheless was reelected by, not 92%, but by a large margin. Right. So do you take that away from the people and you say, we don't care what you said, even though you know what he did?
What do you think? Do you think all the huffing and puffing about what he did was overwrought, more than fits the crime?
Well, I don't know. Let's not call it a crime. I don't know that the prosecutors. Yeah, I think what he did was pretty lousy, but I think there was a lot of hyperbole in the way it was dealt with. There was a lot of screaming and yelling about what was a shabby thing. It was shabby. It is inexcusable.
It's the first victory speech that I've ever seen that started with an apology.
I mean, it was just shabby is the best word I can think of it.
Last thing.
For it.
At the President's news conference today, in addition to announcing the resignation of Secretary Rumsfeld, Mr. Bush ate a little crow. Last week, he had chastised the Democrats for measuring for drapes, as I think he put it, for their new offices before they had won anything. So today, he said this.
And in my first act of bipartisan outreach since the election, I shared with her the names of some Republican interior decorators who can help her pick out the new drapes in her new offices.
The last word, that was very forthcoming. The self-deprecating.
It was clever. It was a clever line that someone wrote for him. Fine. Now what?
Now what? It's
now
a new
what?
world. Joyce Purnick, thank you very much. Coming up in a minute, being black and passing for white. This is Brian Lehrer Live.
When it comes to continuing education, all stops lead to CUNY. More than 200,000 New Yorkers of all ages in all 5 boroughs are enrolled in CUNY adult education courses. If you're looking for new job skills to enhance your career, start a new career, or if you want to enjoy a class in the arts, sciences, and humanities, then get on the train and come to one of CUNY's 19 campuses. CUNY continuing and professional education programs offer you more opportunities than any other learning institution in New York City. CUNY gives you high-quality instruction at low cost with schedules to meet your busy lifestyle. For more information, call 1-866-344-CUNY or log on to www.cuny.edu/continuinged. Hurry up, don't miss your stop, come to CUNY.
Prominent professors, outstanding students, illustrious alumni, all on the Emmy-nominated magazine show about CUNY. Hi, I'm Diana Ravinka. Join us every week as we bring you stories about the people and programs that make CUNY a place where you study with the best.
This is Brian Lehrer Live. We're here live Wednesday nights at 7:30. Now we continue our series showing you some excellent examples of television reporting about race. These examples all come from a new book, DVD, and website called The Authentic Voice, the best reporting on race and ethnicity, compiled by the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism and the Poynter Institute for Excellence in Journalism. Tonight, we look at a story about one family's secret racial identity as told by the ABC News Magazine program 2020. As it happens, the producer of the story is also one of the co-editors of The Authentic Voice, so we are doubly lucky to have Alice Pifer with us tonight to watch some excerpts and talk about them with us. Alice is also Director of Professional Education at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. Hi, Alice. Thanks so much for coming in, and congratulations on a wonderful and important book and DVD.
Thank you, Brian. Good to be here.
Now, let's go right to our first clip, which introduces us to a woman named Jill Sims and the family secret she manages to uncover. The correspondent is ABC's Lynn Scher.
All her life she felt alone, disconnected from a family that was split by divorce and enveloped in silence. Jill Atkins Sims says no one spoke about it, but she always had a sense there was a family secret.
I thought it could be anywhere from illegitimacy to incest to prostitution to all sorts of things.
You imagined the worst, as it were.
Of course, yes.
Not even the relative she felt closest to, her father's mother, Ellen, would tell.
I'd say, well, was your mother born in Boston? She'd say yes. And I'd say, well, where was her mother born? And she'd just sort of pause and say, Virginia. And just look at me in a way that I knew that the discussion was closed.
The abrupt silences left Jill with a feeling of undefined shame.
There was always just a sense that you just kept your head down and low, and you didn't talk about yourself, you didn't advertise yourself in any way, and you basically hid yourself. Put your jacket on.
After Jill got married and later had a son, her grandmother started to open up, finally showing her a photograph of Jill's great-grandmother.
She just quickly showed it to me and said, this was my mother. And I couldn't see it all that well because it was a very dark photograph. And my grandmother just sort of took it back and said, well, that was my mother. And that was it.
That was it until a year later, when her grandmother died and the secret started seeping out. Jill learned that her great-great-grandfather had been black. It was a stunning revelation, but surprisingly, Jill shrugged it off.
I immediately thought that he had to be the only one.
Why did you think that?
Because my family looks so white.
Family therapist Dr. Elaine Pinderhughes is familiar with the problems some whites have absorbing the discovery of black ancestors.
Is that typical to think, oh, he must have been the only one?
Oh, sure. The standard reaction is, it ain't so, or I don't want it to be so, or I'm not even thinking about it.
It was a mark of shame for a long time.
Absolutely.
But Jill was intrigued, and following her only lead, eventually emailed Vassar College, where her great-grandmother, Anita Hemmings, the woman she'd seen only once in that fuzzy photo, had gone. The news exploded on her computer screen the next day. Anita Hemmings, according to Vassar, was the first African-American graduate of this college, although apparently for most of her college career, she passed as white.
I burst into tears when I read the email. I just was overwhelmed. I had no idea that my family had such a history.
So, you tell us in the book that you found this story when you were looking for something else.
Yes.
How did that happen?
Well, in 1999, I started to become aware that there was going to be this historic gathering at Monticello where the descendants of Sally Hemings, who was a slave of Thomas Jefferson and had at least one child with him, and many believe all of her children were fathered by Thomas Jefferson. Her descendants were going to meet the descendants of Thomas Jefferson, the descendants of Martha and Thomas, the white descendants, for the first time.
Because it was finally proven in 1998 when DNA technology advanced to the point that they could test the remains of at least one of Sally Hemings' children.
Right. Right, and so through that they were able to establish that at least one of Sally's children was the son of Thomas Jefferson.
Which is an amazing thing in and of
Yes.
itself.
All
I
these
remember
years
talking
later.
about it on the air at the time. 200 years of speculation.
Right.
Proof.
Right. So but the meeting that was going to happen at Monticello was very contentious. Within the Jefferson, the descendants of Martha and Thomas, some people wanted descendants of Sally there and others did not. But that year, those who wanted them there won out. I was pursuing that story. But then when I realized it was going to be covered by news organizations all over the globe, I decided to back off because I was working at 2020, and by the time we got a story on the air, it was going to be old. It either had to be a breaking news story or it had to be a documentary. And when I told somebody, one of my contacts, he said, oh, well, I have another story for you then. Jill Sim. You should, she's going to be coming, and you should learn about her.
So what were you trying to accomplish with the story other than just telling a good yarn?
I was trying to help people in this country understand through one story a lot about the racial history of our country. I mean, Jill, the story of Jill and her family isn't, you know, one isolated story. It's really a microcosm that talks about the fact that, you know, if you look at her great-grandparents and they called themselves, quote, Negroes or mulattoes at the turn of 1896 or 1900, that means that they had and they were able to pass, that means that they had Afro-European genetics, biology. Now, a lot of that came about because, you know, of slave owners taking advantage or raping the slaves. It wasn't always, you know, but so a lot of people wanted to deny that this was part of our country's history. And also all the ramifications. I think most black families, every black person I know of, they know about passing. They know of a distant relative who's passed. Most white people don't know about that. So I wanted to also bridge that divide and help people learn about each other's cultures.
Let's get a little bit more into the passing aspect of the story. Let's look at another clip from The Family Secret. Remember, Jill had discovered that her great-grandmother was the first African-American ever to graduate from Vassar College, but there was more.
When Jill heard the full story of Anita Hemings' time at Vassar, she was even more overwhelmed. In 1893, the year Anita arrived at Vassar, the school didn't admit blacks. So Anita, whose mixed heritage gave her very pale skin, presented herself as white. It's called passing. and it wasn't uncommon.
Passing was a survival technique because of the terrible social restrictions, the Jim Crow laws, every kind of restriction on a black person.
Anita was living a double life until the end of her senior year, when her roommate, who discovered the truth, viciously outed her. The story became a major scandal. Aristocratic Vassar, of all places, harboring a black student. In a secret session, Vassar's authorities considered withholding Anita's degree.
When you heard that story, tell me how you reacted.
I hated her roommate. I hated white people. I hated the ugliness that people are capable of when it comes to race.
In the end, Anita did graduate, but Jill was in for more. Next, she discovered that Anita's brother had been one of the first black graduates of MIT.
A photograph of Frederick arrived in the mail, and he was definitely a black-looking young man.
With Frederick, Jill realized that an entire branch of her family had been black. Now she wondered, what was she?
Did you look at your hands?
Oh,
Did
yeah.
you say, who am I? What am I?
Yes, I used to look in the mirror, and I looked at my blue eyes and my red hair and white skin, and I just thought, gosh, you know, I started wondering, what is blackness and what is whiteness?
What is blackness and what is whiteness? If any of you have any passing stories, yourself, a relative, a friend, someone you know, we'll take them on the air during this segment. Call us with your passing stories. If you are African American or otherwise non-white and have passed as white or know someone who has, give us a call, 212-251-0801, 212-251-0801. What is it like being in the closet in that respect? Is there a price to pay? We'll talk about the price that Jill's family paid as we continue with our guest, Alice Pifer. Alice, you and Lynn Scher are both white, or maybe you're passing. No, you say in the book that you're white.
As far as I know, that my heritage is Irish and German.
And yet you say that you felt it was important to involve African Americans on your reporting team.
Yes.
Tell us why and in what roles.
Well, in this case, the associate producer, a woman named Susan Welsh, is black, and the production secretary for the unit that I was working in, there was a group of 10 producers, is black, but she played much more of a researcher role. And beginning, there was Lynn, me, and senior producer, Meredith White, is white. So I thought, well, you know, even though we're all well-intentioned white people, we could have blind spots. So I made sure that we had a racially mixed team. I also made sure that I showed the piece, once it was developed, to one of the black producers there. And I think it added a lot because, for instance, Donna and Susan and I had many discussions about what it would mean in a black family to have someone disappear. There was also debates. Donna at that time was about 21. She had a lot more judgments about Anita and Andrew's passing than middle-class black people that I worked with at ABC News. So, but what everyone shared in the discussions was a sense of pain in the family. So it really informed my producing that I really needed to convey that in the story to help people get a gut feeling for what it means when someone disappears from the flock.
Yeah, and as you point out, the early 20th century, when that part of the story was taking place, was the heyday for passing among light-skinned blacks. So is that one of the places where the importance of historical context comes into play in journalism?
Absolutely, because if you look at what Anita and Andrew did through the prism of today, someone, for instance, like Donna, who was working on the project, at first was like, what the hell were they doing? How could they betray their race? How could they be filled with so much self-hatred? But she learned herself, and I'm sure white people would learn even more, most likely, most whites, that all of the opportunities that Andrew and Anita were denied. Now, many black people I've talked to have mixed feelings about Andrew and Anita and what they did. Just briefly, some people feel like, great, they got over on the white man, they got their opportunities, they gave their children opportunities. Other people feel they could have been part of the Black Renaissance. But W.E.B. Du Bois mentions Anita Hemmings in in some of his writings.
Really?
So they were black intelligentsia. They could have been part of that movement in the late 1800s, early 1900s to advance lives for black people, and some people feel that they abandoned black people in that way.
I think we have someone else's passing story here. Lisa in Morningside Heights, thank you very much for calling.
Yes, I'm not passing myself, but I called to say that my maternal, on my mother's side, her mother, my grandmother, born and raised in Savannah, Georgia, but her two brothers chose to pass, and they could, very fair-skinned, straight hair, and moved to Boston, and we never heard from them again. But they're definitely in Boston, and sometimes when I meet Holmes in, you know, Cambridge, I have friends who live there, I often wonder, you know, am I a relation to you? But,
and it's so interesting that you use the phrase never heard from again, because Alice, a minute ago, you used the word disappeared. And I thought, wow, disappeared. That's strong. But they disappeared from the black community because they couldn't be seen in that context.
Right, right.
Lisa, how do you know about these relatives from a long time ago?
Oh, well, my grandmother told my mother. For one thing, you know, no one ever really wants to talk about that too much. It's a little embarrassing to know, obviously, that there's something that went on that was untoward, rape or miscegenation, something.
So
but
similar.
We know that we never heard from them again, and that they definitely immigrated to Boston.
It's so similar to Jill's story from the piece. What are your own feelings about them doing that when you think about it?
Well, to be quite frank, my feelings have evolved, and the feeling that I have now is that I think in those days you had to be, and perhaps even today, made of very stern stuff to be able to cope with the discrimination. And I frankly think it's a personal choice. If they feel that they couldn't cope and they needed to pass in order to live a fuller life, I think they have a right to do so.
Thank you very much for calling. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
In this next clip, we learn more about the meaning of the family secret about Jill's great-grandmother passing as white and some of Jill's emotions toward it.
A trace of African ancestry meant you were considered black and thus deprived of many rights. Jill was startled to learn that she too would have been restricted by those laws.
I did not realize how many forms racism took in this country until I started looking into my own family. And I really started looking at the world in a new way.
In particular, Jill wanted to know how her family had faded to white. She found out that Anita Hemmings returned to this black community in Boston after Vassar, and later married another light-skinned African-American, Andrew Love, a physician. But in 1907, they moved to New York and made the dramatic decision to live as whites for the rest of their lives. Their decision to pass gave Anita, Andrew, and their 3 children opportunities in the white world, but it also brought anguish.
I think that it caused a lot of pain very often to the person who was passing and the persons who were left behind.
Take Anita's daughter, Ellen, Jill's grandmother. She was raised as white and isolated from her cousins, grandparents, aunts, and uncles. If word got out about their black heritage, her parents could have lost their jobs, even their home and friends, so they kept their black family a secret. The only way Ellen's grandma, Dora, could see her grandchildren would be to steal a glance on carefully planned vacations.
They would meet at an appointed place, and the grandmother would just look and watch her grandchildren from a distance.
That's so sad. Doesn't that just break your heart?
The whole thing breaks my heart, yeah.
And once, just once, Dora came to Anita's home in New York.
Anita made her use the servants' entrance to visit her. This was done so that Andrew and Anita would not be outed, because they lived in an all-white building.
Are you angry at her at all?
Yes. I go through periods where I'm very angry at her because I feel that she denied her children and her grandchildren wonderful family. And they needed that family.
Now, despite the richness of this story, the family secret, the racial tension, the Thomas Jefferson-Sally Hemings connection, you had trouble selling this at first to your editor.
Mm-hmm.
How come?
I think the executive producer at the time, he just found the story boring. He just couldn't connect. I think that it was an example of a racial divide that we often talk about, that white people and black people, or people of different races, and white people can experience the same information, the same event in very different ways. He was like, he almost flew it back on me in the sense if he said, so what if her great-grandparents are black? You got a problem with that? It's like, no, it's not about me having a problem with that. It's a slice of American history. And she felt this secret throughout the generations, even though she didn't know what it was. So anyway, he was very resistant, and I campaigned until he finally gave in.
It's at least the second example that we've screened in this series where the producer who had the idea had trouble selling it to their executive producer.
Right.
Do you think that's a theme with respect to racial stories?
You know, journalists always are in the battle and the struggle of selling stories to their executive producers and to their editors, but I do think it happens to a greater extent with stories about race and ethnicity. I think there's more sensitivity.
Why?
I think, for instance, there's resistance. I think there's a lot, some executive producers or editors are worried about causing controversy. They're worried about their broadcast or their newspaper stepping in a controversy they didn't mean to get into. And that's one piece. And the other piece is, I think sometimes if the management tends to be more white than not, stories that might be of importance to people of color are not of importance to the people in management if they're more white.
I think we have another passing story. Sarah in Park Slope, thank you very much for calling.
Hello.
Hi.
So I just called because I'm from Louisiana, and I grew up half black and half white, but I look very white. And so I grew up not passing as the people did in history, but sort of passing.
It's a decision you have to make almost on a person-by-person basis. How much am I going to come out to this person about my race?
Kind of, yes. Like, for example, I'd be in a situation with friends, and I grew up in a white neighborhood, so I'd be with a bunch of white kids, and we'd be hanging out, and then someone would start to talk about race, and they would start to share their feelings about how they really felt about black people. And so at that point, as a kid, you know, it's a very difficult place to be in.
Right. And so do you now make conscious judgments as to when to and when not to bring it up? Do you go, you know, incognito or try to put it in people's faces in certain situations? Or what's your relationship to it as a grown-up?
Well, I think that I had to go through a lot of changes. Like, it affected me a lot personally in my personal life. And so I finally went to therapy and started to deal with it. And I realized first that I was so angry for so many years, and then I didn't know how to deal with it. But now I've learned to deal with it. And I think that a lot of people, when I have brought up the subject, people feel really bad. And so I'm not so angry anymore. Like, I just think that people, they repeat what their parents have told them. They don't necessarily, I mean, they are racist, but I don't know, it's a difficult subject. It's hard to
Right,
summarize
but you
it.
have a little more compassion toward accepting people where they are and starting from there.
Right, and try to help people understand the situation.
Thank you, Sarah. I really appreciate your candor on this. Well, now we see the part of the story where the descendants of Sally Hemings actually meet the other descendants of Thomas Jefferson, mostly for the first time, and for the first time, Jill Sims is among them.
She's been told that her great-great-grandfather is somehow related to Sally Hemings, the slave who is said to have had at least one child with Thomas Jefferson. Robert Hemings was born near Jefferson's plantation at Monticello in Virginia.
Okay, let's go.
So when Jill was invited to the historic meeting of Jefferson and Hemings descendants at Monticello last May, she was delighted. It would be her first chance to meet some living black relatives, admittedly very distant, but to Jill, relatives nonetheless.
I'm really excited to meet my black cousins and see if there is a connection there, if I feel that there is an ancient bond there that can't be defined but is felt. Nice to meet you.
Once at Monticello, Jill and her family felt instantly connected.
I was saying the same thing about you. Thank you.
And this is my husband, Alan.
Nice to meet you.
And my son, Harrison.
Harrison, good to meet you. Are you Pifer family? I am.
You said before you got there you were anxious to see if there will be an ancient bond there.
Yes.
Was there?
Yes. I really felt very attached to a lot of people there very quickly. I felt like I truly belonged someplace for the very first time in my life. I felt like family.
All right, it's full disclosure time, Alice. You produced this story, but it's also included in your book on the best reporting on race and ethnicity. Did someone else judge it?
Yes, yes. This story won the award that Columbia University gives every year for excellence in reporting on race and ethnicity. They select about 10 newspaper stories, 10 television stories, and when the family...
You convinced me. You don't have to
I just want to say it. When the family secret was chosen, I was still an employee of ABC News.
Okay. Do you think this story could have been done badly, destructively?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think in the wrong hands. I think if people didn't, for instance, provide the context, you could look at Anita and Andrew and say, you know, this makes no sense.
You
How
could just
cruel of them to walk away from their family.
Right.
If people didn't understand Jim Crow, if they didn't understand, you know, what black people were up against in 1907 when they decided to leave. So I think that there could be ways that could have been done. Destructive is striking me as a very strong word, but it could have done harm.
Next week, we'll screen another example from the best reporting on race and ethnicity, The Authentic Voice. Do you think something ties all these stories together in terms of what makes quality journalism about race and ethnicity?
Yes, we've given this a lot of thought. My co-editors, Arlene Morgan, Keith Woods, and myself, and actually a group of people who were involved before even I was involved. And here are the three things: voice, context, and complexity. We find that every story that we think meets the mark of excellence has those qualities in them, and that they, in the end, add up to authenticity in the feeling of the story.
This is a heavy question to ask you in our last 30 seconds, but has your relationship to your own whiteness changed by reporting on race and by doing this book?
My relationship to my own whiteness has started to change when I was 15 and has continued to change, and has even more so as I did the book.
Real quick, why then? What happened when you were 15?
I was in Detroit. What people call the riots, the uprising of black people, happened in Detroit when I was 15. And instead of running and hiding, I went and bought books because Detroit was completely segregated, and I wanted to know what is happening.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Brian.
That's it for tonight's show. Next week at this time, we will see another example of excellence in TV reporting about race. Meanwhile, you can visit the website of The Authentic Voice to learn more. It's theauthenticvoice.org. And join me tomorrow morning for my daily radio show on WNYC, New York Public Radio. Tomorrow, Democratic Congressman Anthony Weiner of Brooklyn and Queens looks forward to life in the majority party. That's at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning on 93.9 and AM 820 WNYC or at WNYC.org. Have a great night. One of the things I